The winter wind cuts through the Norwegian fjord like a blade, carrying the scent of snow and desperation. A small figure stumbles through the darkness toward the flickering torches of a Viking settlement, bare feet leaving bloody prints in the frost-covered earth. The child's breath comes in ragged gasps, each step a battle against hunger and exhaustion that has lasted for days. At the settlement's edge, massive warriors pause their evening tasks to stare at this unexpected arrival. The orphan's clothes are little more than rags, thin arms wrapped around a shivering frame that speaks of too many nights without shelter or sustenance. With trembling lips, the child approaches the towering chieftain and whispers words that will echo through generations. "Give me the hardest job. I'll do it. Just let me stay one night." But what happens when one night becomes a lifetime, and a desperate plea transforms into an unbreakable Viking bond? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ragnar Ironbeard stood like an ancient oak against the wind, his weathered face carved by 40 winters of leadership and warfare. The iron oath ring on his thick finger caught the torchlight as he studied the trembling child before him. Around the settlement's central fire, his warriors had gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. "Another mouth to feed," muttered Bjorn the Red, spitting into the flames. "Winter's hard enough without taking in strays." The child clutched a worn leather pouch against their chest, the only possession that had survived whatever tragedy had led to this moment. Inside, Ragnar glimpsed the edge of something carved. Bone, perhaps, worked with the skill that spoke of better times and lost families. "Please," the child whispered again, swaying on their feet. "Just one night. I'll work harder than anyone. I'll do whatever you ask." Ragnar's mind traveled back through the years to another winter, another desperate soul seeking shelter. He had been barely 14 when the plague took his parents, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that showed little mercy to the weak. Old Thorvald had found him half frozen outside the settlement gates, more dead than alive. "What's your name, child?" Ragnar's voice carried the authority of command, but not the coldness his warriors expected. I don't remember much before the fire." The words came in broken Norse, accented with something foreign. "They called me many things, none of them kind." Astrid, Ragnar's 16-year-old daughter, stepped forward from where she'd been tending the wounded from their latest raid. Her blonde braids caught the firelight as she knelt beside the child, her healer's instincts overriding political considerations. "Father, look at these injuries. This child has been traveling for days, maybe weeks. Those feet need tending, and that cough—" She lifted the child's chin gently. "When did you last eat?" The child's eyes, an unusual green that seemed to hold depths beyond their apparent years, met Astrid's with desperate gratitude. 3 days, maybe 4. Time becomes strange when you're always moving. The settlement had grown quiet, except for the crackling of fires and the distant lowing of cattle in their winter shelters. Ragnar felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes upon him, waiting for a decision that would set precedent for how they dealt with the lost and desperate who might seek their protection. "The sacred fire," he said finally, his words carrying across the settlement like a pronouncement from the gods themselves. "It burns in the temple hall, has burned without fail since my grandfather's time. One person and one person alone tends it through each night. They must never let it die, never let it burn too bright, never abandon their post until dawn breaks." Eric the Younger, barely past his own childhood, looked up from sharpening his blade. "That's my task, chieftain. I've kept the fire these past 2 years, and you've done well, Eric. But tonight you'll teach another." Ragnar's gaze returned to the child. "This will be your hardest job, little one. The fire that connects us to the gods, that keeps the spirits of our ancestors burning bright in the long darkness. Fail, and you bring misfortune upon us all. Succeed, and you earn your place by our hearth." The child straightened despite obvious exhaustion, showing a spine of steel beneath the ragged exterior. "I understand. I won't fail you, see that you don't." But Ragnar's tone had softened slightly. Something in the child's bearing, the way they had approached without cowering, the intelligence in those strange green eyes, it reminded him of someone, perhaps himself at that age, or perhaps something else entirely. As Astrid led the child toward the temple hall, Ragnar caught a glimpse of what lay within the leather pouch, a carved bone raven. Its wings, spread in flight, worked with such skill that it seemed ready to take wing. Ravens were sacred to Odin, messengers between the world of men and the realm of the gods. Interesting choice, Ragnar, said Ulf the Wise, his eldest advisor. The child carries Odin's bird and speaks with strange accent. There may be more to this story than meets the eye. Ragnar nodded slowly, watching as Eric began explaining the sacred duty to his replacement. The child listened with intensity that bordered on reverence, understanding instinctively that this was no mere test of endurance, but an honor that carried the weight of generations. The night would tell them much about their unexpected visitor. By dawn, they would know whether mercy had brought them a blessing or a burden. The temple hall stood at the heart of the settlement, its timber walls blackened by decades of smoke and ceremony. Ancient firestones, passed down through generations and blessed by the priests of Loki, sat arranged in a sacred circle around the eternal flame. The child approached them with reverence, understanding instinctively that these were no ordinary rocks but artifacts that connected the living world to the realm of the gods. Eric demonstrated the delicate balance required, how to feed the fire without smothering it, how to read the flames for signs of divine favor or displeasure, how to maintain the steady glow that would guide lost spirits home through the long winter night. The stones must never grow cold, Eric explained, his young voice serious with responsibility. They hold the blessing of the fire god himself. Touch them only when the flame grows weak, and speak the old words as you strike them together. The child nodded, memorizing every detail. As Eric departed, leaving them alone with the sacred duty, the weight of responsibility settled upon thin shoulders like a cloak of lead. The fire danced hypnotically, casting shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own across the carved pillars that supported the hall. Hours passed in careful vigilance. The child fed the flames with measured pieces of birch and oak, watching for the subtle changes that Eric had warned might signal trouble. Outside, the wind howled through the settlement like a living thing, rattling shutters and sending snow spiraling past the small windows. Near midnight, Bjorn the Red entered the hall with obvious suspicion, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. His scarred face reflected the firelight as he studied the child's work with critical eyes. "Strange how Ragnar takes in every stray that wanders to our gates," he muttered, circling the fire like a predator. "Tell me, little mouse, what brings you so far from wherever mice like you belong?" The child continued tending the fire, refusing to be baited by the warrior's obvious hostility. "I go where the gods guide me, same as anyone." "The gods?" Bjorn laughed harshly. "What would the gods want with a scrawny thing like you? More likely you're running from justice somewhere. Maybe carrying word back to enemies who'd pay well for knowledge of our defenses." Before the child could respond, a new sound cut through the wind, a long, mournful howl that raised the hair on every neck in the settlement. Then another, closer this time, answered by a chorus that spoke of hunger and desperation. Wolves, a pack by the sound of it, driven down from the high country by the same harsh winter that had brought the child to their gates. Bjorn's hand moved to his weapon as shouts arose from the guards on the settlement's perimeter. The wolves were testing their defenses, looking for weakness in the barriers that protected livestock and people alike. "Stay with the fire," Bjorn commanded. But the child was already moving, grabbing one of the sacred firestones and a burning brand from the eternal flame. "What are you doing?" Bjorn demanded. "What needs doing?" The child ran toward the settlement's edge, where panicked voices suggested the wolves had found a gap in the defenses. At the livestock pens, chaos reigned. A section of the wooden barrier had given way under repeated assault, and grey shapes moved like phantoms through the falling snow. The settlement's dogs barked frantically, But they were outnumbered and outmatched by the desperate pack. Without hesitation, the child struck the sacred firestone against the wooden post, sending sparks cascading into the dry fodder stored nearby. The flames caught instantly, creating a wall of light and heat that sent the wolves retreating with yelps of surprise. Warriors arrived with weapons drawn, but the immediate crisis had passed. The wolves, faced with fire and the growing number of defenders, melted back into the darkness like the shadows they resembled. "Clever thinking," admitted Thorstein the builder, surveying the damage. The fire drove them off before they could take any livestock, but Bjorn's expression remained skeptical. Anyone could have thought to use fire against wolves. Proves nothing about trust or loyalty. The child said nothing, simply returned to the temple hall, where the eternal flame still burned steadily in its sacred circle. The night was far from over, and there were still hours of vigilance ahead before dawn would release them from their duty. As the settlement settled back into watchful quiet, Ragnar appeared in the temple doorway. He had witnessed the quick thinking that saved their livestock, seen how the child acted without thought for personal safety when the community was threatened. "The sacred stones were used well tonight," he said quietly, noting how carefully the child had returned the firestone to its proper place in the circle. "The gods smile upon those who protect what matters most." The child looked up from tending the flames, those strange green eyes reflecting something that might have been relief or perhaps the first stirring of hope. "I gave my word, chieftain. The fire will not die while I watch over it." Dawn was still hours away, but already something had shifted in the relationship between the settlement and its newest member. Dawn broke grey and cold over the settlement, painting the snow-covered roofs in shades of pewter and silver. The child emerged from the temple hall as Eric arrived to reclaim his duties, the sacred fire having burned steadily through the long night. Word of the wolf encounter had spread quickly, and curious glances followed the small figure as they made their way toward the communal kitchens. Astrid met them at the great hall's entrance, carrying a carved wooden bowl, simple but well made, the kind of vessel that marked the difference between guest and member. "Father says you've earned your place at our table," she said, ladling porridge from the large iron pot that fed the settlement each morning. The child accepted the bowl with trembling hands, understanding instinctively that this represented something more than mere sustenance. In a community where every resource was precious and every mouth represented both burden and potential, the right to share meals was a privilege that carried weight. "Thank you," the child whispered, the words thick with emotion that went beyond simple gratitude for food. Old Helga, the settlement's head cook, watched with sharp eyes as the orphan ate with careful manners, despite obvious hunger. "Knows how to hold a spoon proper," she muttered approvingly. "Wasn't raised by wolves, whatever else might be true." As the days passed into weeks, the child found their place in the settlement's rhythm. During daylight hours, when others tended the sacred fire, there were countless tasks that required willing hands. The child hauled water from the well, helped mend fishing nets, and learned to recognize the subtle signs that predicted weather changes in the mountain air. It was this last skill that first marked them as potentially valuable beyond mere labor. Standing beside Ragnar one morning as the chieftain studied the sky, the child pointed toward a bank of clouds gathering over the western peaks. "Storm coming," they said quietly. "Not today, but tomorrow before midday. Heavy snow, the kind that bends trees and traps travelers." Ragnar followed the child's gaze, noting details he might have missed, the way the wind shifted, the particular color of the distant clouds, the behavior of birds preparing for harsh weather. "How can you be certain? The air tastes different before big storms. And see how the smoke from our fires doesn't rise straight up? That means the pressure's changing." The child's knowledge came not from formal teaching, but from seasons of living exposed to nature's moods, learning to read the sky the way others read runes. By the next day, when snow began falling in thick curtains exactly as predicted, word of the child's weather sense had spread throughout the settlement. Practical people who lived at nature's mercy quickly recognized the value of such insight, and attitudes began to shift from suspicion toward grudging respect. "Useful skill," commented Ulf the Wise as he watched the child help secure livestock before the storm's full fury arrived. "The gods give different gifts to different souls. Perhaps they sent us exactly what we needed, even if we didn't know we needed it." Astrid found herself drawn to the orphan's quiet competence. Unlike the boastful young warriors who competed for attention and status, this strange child simply worked without complaint, asking intelligent questions and absorbing knowledge like parched earth absorbing rain. "What was your family like?" she asked one afternoon as they worked together, preparing wool for spinning. "Before whatever happened that brought you here?" The child's hands stilled for a moment, green eyes growing distant with memory. "I remember warmth, voices singing, someone who smelled of herbs and honey when she held me close at night. But it's like looking at shadows on water. The harder I try to see clearly, the more everything shifts and changes." "The fire that took them," Astrid said gently. "You remember that?" "Flames, screaming, running through smoke until my lungs burned and my eyes streamed tears." The child resumed working, fingers moving steadily through the wool. "I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and then I kept walking. I think I walked for a very long time before I found you." Astrid reached out and briefly touched the child's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that spoke to the gentle heart beneath her warrior's training. "You're safe now. Father doesn't make promises lightly, and he's promised you shelter." As winter deepened and the settlement drew closer together against the cold, the child's place became more secure. They learned Norse words and customs with remarkable speed, their foreign accent gradually softening into something that belonged to this place and these people. The carved wooden bowl became a symbol of belonging, carried to each meal and cleaned with care afterward. Small as it was, it represented something the child had never truly possessed before: the right to belong somewhere, to be part of something larger and more permanent than mere survival. When Bjorn the Red finally nodded approval one evening, after the child correctly predicted a sudden thaw that would affect their ice fishing, even the most skeptical began to accept that perhaps Ragnar's mercy had brought them an unexpected gift rather than an unwelcome burden. The morning brought the thunder of hoofbeats and the harsh music of iron against iron as Ragnar's warband returned from their winter raids. 30 warriors rode through the settlement gates, their horses steaming in the cold air, their weapons bearing the marks of recent battle. At their head rode Magnus the Terrible, Ragnar's younger brother, whose reputation for ferocity had spread across 3 kingdoms. The child watched from beside the well as the raiders dismounted, noting the way other settlement members stepped back to give them space. These were not the familiar faces who had grown accustomed to the orphan's presence over the past month, but hardened men who measured worth in strength and cunning alone. Magnus strode toward his brother with the confident swagger of one who had never known defeat. His dark beard was streaked with grey, his arms marked with scars that told stories of countless battles. When his eyes fell upon the child, they narrowed with immediate suspicion. "So, this is the stray you've taken in," Magnus said, his voice carrying across the settlement yard. "Doesn't look like much. Hardly worth the food it takes to keep breathing." Ragnar's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm. "The child has proven useful, brother. Skilled at reading weather, quick thinking when wolves threatened our livestock. Useful?" Magnus spat into the snow. "We're Vikings, not shepherds. What use is weather reading when enemies mass at our borders?" He turned to address his warriors, his voice rising so all could hear. "Has my brother grown soft in my absence, taking in weaklings while real threats gather strength?" The settlement had grown quiet, sensing the tension that crackled between the brothers like lightning before a storm. This was more than simple disagreement about the child's presence. This was a challenge to Ragnar's judgment and authority. Thorkel the weaponsmith stepped forward from his forge, carrying something wrapped in oiled leather. "If the child is to stay, they must prove themselves by our traditions," he said, unwrapping a wooden practice sword. The weapon was carefully crafted, lighter than the iron blades the warriors carried, but balanced to teach proper technique. "The trials," Magnus said with cruel satisfaction. "Let the whelp face what every warrior's child must endure. If they survive, they earn the right to remain. If not—" He shrugged eloquently. The child stepped forward without hesitation, accepting the wooden sword with steady hands. The weapon felt strange, but somehow familiar, as if muscle memory from another life guided their grip. "3 trials," announced Ulf the Wise, following traditions as old as the settlement itself. "Strength, skill, and spirit. Each must be met with honor. The first trial was simple brutality, arm wrestling against Eric the Younger, who despite his name possessed the thick muscles of a born warrior. The child's slender arms seemed pitifully inadequate against such strength, but they approached the contest with surprising calm. The match lasted longer than anyone expected. Where Eric relied on raw power, the child used leverage and timing, holding their own for precious minutes before finally succumbing. The watching warriors murmured approval. Losing was acceptable, but losing with courage earned respect. The second trial tested skill with blade work against Strid herself, armed with her own wooden practice sword. She moved with fluid grace, her technique polished by years of training, but the child adapted quickly to each attack. Their style was unorthodox, mixing defensive moves with sudden, unpredictable strikes that caught even experienced observers by surprise. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Astrid asked as their blades crossed for the final time, both breathing hard from exertion. "I don't remember learning," the child admitted. "It just feels natural." The third trial would test spirit, enduring pain without crying out while a heated iron brand pressed against the forearm, leaving a mark that would identify them as settlement-born. The child knelt before the fire, where Thorkel heated the branding iron, watching the metal glow cherry-red in the flames. When the iron touched skin, the scent of burning flesh filled the air, but the child made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. Tears streamed down their face, but their lips remained pressed firmly together until Thorkel lifted the brand away. Magnus examined the fresh mark with grudging approval. "The whelp has spine, I'll grant that, but spine alone doesn't make a warrior." "No," agreed Ragnar quietly, helping the child to their feet. "But spine, intelligence, and quick thinking together make something valuable, something worth protecting and nurturing." As Thorkel wrapped the burn with clean cloth, the child looked around at the faces surrounding them. Some showed approval, others remained skeptical, but none showed the open hostility that had greeted their arrival a month earlier. The wooden sword remained in their hands, no longer a test, but a tool. The first tool of a life they were only beginning to understand might be possible. The fever came suddenly in the depths of winter, striking the child down like a blow from Thor's hammer. What began as a simple cough in the morning had become a raging illness by nightfall, leaving them delirious and burning with heat despite the bitter cold outside. Astrid tended the sickbed with the skill her mother had taught her before death claimed the chieftain's wife. She brewed willow bark tea for the fever, applied cool cloths to the burning forehead, and listened with growing fascination to the words that tumbled from the child's lips in delirium. "The ships," the child whispered, thrashing against the furs that covered them. "The dragon ships coming across the water. Father, why don't they answer our signals? Why do they burn everything?" Astrid leaned closer, her heart racing as she recognized words spoken in a dialect she had heard before, the formal court language of the northern kingdoms. "Not the common tongue of farmers and fishermen. Mother, hide the crown. Hide it where the fire cannot reach. The bloodline must survive, must remember." The child's voice trailed off into incoherent murmuring, but their hand clutched desperately at something beneath their pillow. When Astrid gently pried the fingers loose, she found herself holding the runic stone fragment the child had carried since their arrival. In the flickering lamplight, she could make out partial inscriptions carved deep into the weathered surface, not the simple household runes used for marking property, but the formal script reserved for royal proclamations and sacred ceremonies. Ericsson, blood of kings, she whispered, translating the fragments she could decipher. The implications sent ice through her veins. Despite the warmth of the sick room, old Sven Runereader was summoned from his hermit's cave in the high mountains, the one man in the region who possessed the knowledge to read the ancient scripts. His gnarled hands trembled slightly as he examined the stone fragment, his cloudy eyes widening with recognition. "This bears the mark of the house of Eric," he said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. "The royal line that ruled the northern reaches before the great burning, before the dragon ships came and left nothing but ash and memory." Ragnar sat heavily in his chair, the wooden frame creaking under his weight. "The child spoke true then. Royal blood flows in those veins. More than royal blood," Sven continued, tracing the partial inscriptions with one weathered finger. "If I read these runes correctly, this child is not merely of noble birth, but direct heir to the throne that was lost. The last of a line that ruled for 300 years before Magnus Bloodaxe put every member of the royal house to the sword." The revelation settled over the room like a funeral shroud. Political implications stretched in every direction, claims to thrones that no longer existed, enemies who would kill to prevent any restoration, allies who might rally to an ancient name if they believed restoration possible. "Magnus Bloodaxe rules the northern reaches now," Astrid said quietly. "If he learns that Eric's heir survived his purge, he would come with fire and sword to finish what he began," Ragnar finished grimly. "The child's very existence is a threat to his legitimacy." The fever finally broke on the third day, leaving the child weak but lucid. When they woke to find Ragnar, Astrid and Sven gathered around their bed, they immediately sensed that something fundamental had changed. "You know," they said simply. "Not a question, but a statement of fact." "You know who I am. We know who you were," Ragnar corrected gently. "The question is who you choose to be now." The child struggled to sit up, accepting Astrid's help with grateful dignity. "I remember more now. The fever. It brought things back. My father's face when he sent me away with the servants. My mother pressing this stone into my hands and telling me to run, to survive, to remember. And do you remember your true name?" Sven asked softly. "Einar," the child said after a long moment. "My father called me Einar Eriksson, heir to the northern crown, but that boy died in the flames with his family. I am whoever you allow me to become." Ragnar leaned forward, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "Names have power, young one. The name Einar Eriksson could rally armies, or bring death to everyone you've learned to care about. Choose wisely which name you claim." Einar looked around the room, at the faces of people who had become family, understanding fully for the first time the weight of the choice before them. Royal blood meant nothing without a kingdom to rule, but it also meant danger to anyone who offered shelter to the last heir of a murdered dynasty. "For now," Einar said finally, "I choose to remain the orphan who sought shelter from the storm. The other name, perhaps it will matter someday, but not today." The runic stone fragment was carefully wrapped and hidden away, its secrets guarded by those who understood the price of royal blood in a world where crowns were won and lost by the sword. Spring arrived with the violence of a warrior's charge, melting snow cascading down mountainsides in torrents that turned peaceful streams into raging rivers. The settlement stirred with new energy as the long winter's grip finally loosened. And with that stirring came the need for formal decisions about Einar's place among them. The great hall had been prepared for ceremony, its timber walls hung with the banners of Ragnar's clan, ravens and wolves embroidered in silver thread on backgrounds of deep blue. The sacred fires burned at cardinal points around the hall, their smoke carrying prayers to the gods who watched over oaths and family bonds. Einar stood at the hall's center, no longer the desperate waif who had stumbled to their gates months earlier. Good food and hard work had filled out their frames somewhat, though they remained slight compared to the warrior children of the settlement. More importantly, the hunted look had faded from those unusual green eyes, replaced by something approaching confidence. Ragnar rose from his carved chieftain's chair, the silver arm ring gleaming in his weathered hands. The artifact had been in his family for 5 generations, passed from father to chosen heir, inscribed with protective runes and the symbols that marked membership in the clan of the Iron Wolves. Before gods and kinsmen, I claim this child as blood of my blood. Ragnar's voice carried to every corner of the hall. Let any who would contest this claim speak now or hold their peace forever. The silence stretched taut as bowstring, broken only by the crackling of fires and the whisper of wind through the hall's high windows. Magnus had departed with his warband a week earlier, taking his opposition with him. But others remained who might question the wisdom of adopting a child of unknown origins. I speak for the child, Astrid said, stepping forward with the formal bearing of a clan daughter. They have proven courage in facing our trials, wisdom in reading the signs of nature, and loyalty in defending what matters to our people. By these deeds, they have earned the right to call us family, and I speak witness to their character, added Ulf the Wise. In the months since their arrival, this child has brought nothing but benefit to our settlement. The gods smile upon those who show mercy to the lost, and greater still upon those who prove worthy of that mercy. One by one, other voices joined the chorus of acceptance. Eric spoke of Einar's dedication to the sacred fire, never once allowing the eternal flame to fail during their watches. Thorkel praised their quick learning with weapons and tools. Even old Helga grudgingly admitted that anyone who could predict weather with such accuracy deserved a place at their table. When the voices fell silent, Ragnar approached Einar with slow ceremony. The arm ring felt heavy in his hands, not from its silver weight, but from the responsibility it represented. Once placed, it could not be easily removed. Once claimed, a child became clan forever, with all the protections and obligations that entailed. What name will you take as my adopted child? Ragnar asked formally. The name by which the clan will know you, by which the gods will judge you, by which your deeds will be remembered. Einar had wrestled with this question through long winter nights. Their true name carried the weight of royal blood and ancient tragedy, but it also carried dangers that could destroy everyone who sheltered them. Yet to take Ragnar's name completely felt like a betrayal of parents who had died to give them life. I would be Einar Ragnarsson, they said clearly, the words carrying to every listener. But I ask permission to honor the family that gave me birth, even as I claim the family that gave me life. Let me be known as Einar Ragnarsson, called the Foundling, so all will know I was lost and am now found. Ragnar smiled with genuine warmth, understanding the delicate balance Einar sought to maintain. Einar Ragnarsson, called the Foundling, do you swear by Thor's hammer and Odin's spear to defend this clan as your own, to share our fortunes good and ill, to honor our ancestors and protect our descendants? I swear it, Einar replied without hesitation. The silver arm ring slipped over Einar's wrist with surprising ease, as if it had been crafted for this moment. The metal felt warm against their skin, inscribed with runes that promised protection and belonging. Around the great hall, voices rose in the traditional chant that sealed the adoption, words in the old tongue that bound souls together with bonds stronger than blood. The feast that followed lasted until dawn, with mead flowing freely and stories shared that welcomed Einar into the collective memory of the clan. They learned the names of ancestors, stretching back 7 generations, the great victories and noble defeats that defined their people's history, the obligations and privileges that came with claiming a place in that long line of warriors and leaders. As the celebration finally wound down and the hall emptied, Ragnar found Einar standing alone before the great hearth, staring into flames that reminded them of another fire, another life, regrets. The chieftain asked quietly. Gratitude, Einar replied, and determination to prove worthy of the chance you've given me. The arm ring caught the firelight. its silver surface reflecting not just flame, but promise, the promise of belonging, of purpose, of a future that stretched beyond mere survival into something approaching destiny. The arrival of Jarl Grim, the ruthless, came without warning, his longships appearing on the fjord like dark omens against the morning sky. 20 vessels bearing the wolf's head banner of the western clans cut through the water with predatory grace. Their crews, armed for war despite flying the white banner of peaceful intent. Einar watched from the settlement's highest watchtower as the ships beached themselves on the shoreline below. Even from this distance, they could see the glint of mail and weaponry, the disciplined way the crews formed ranks upon landing. This was no casual visit between neighboring chieftains. Trouble, Astrid murmured, joining Einar at the tower's edge. Her hand rested instinctively on her sword hilt, reading the same signs of potential violence in the visitor's bearing. Jarl Grim himself was a giant among giants, standing a full head taller than even Ragnar's tallest warriors. His beard was black as a raven's wing, braided with silver rings that marked his victories in single combat. Across his back, he carried a great two-handed axe that had supposedly never tasted defeat in 40 years of warfare. The formal meeting took place in the Great Hall, with both sides observing the ancient courtesies that governed such encounters. Horn cups filled with mead were shared. Traditional greetings exchanged, but underneath the polite ritual. Tension coiled like a serpent ready to strike. Ragnar Ironbeard, Grim's voice filled the hall like distant thunder. I come seeking answers to rumors that trouble the peace between our peoples. Speak freely, Jarl Grim, Ragnar replied carefully. What rumors bring you so far from your own halls? They say you shelter one who claims royal blood. They say the lost heir of Eric the Just has found sanctuary among your clan. Grim's pale eyes swept the assembled warriors, lingering on Einar with predatory interest. Such claims, if true, could destabilize the entire northern realm. The hall fell silent save for the crackling of fires. Every person present understood the implications. If Magnus Bloodaxe learned that Eric's heir lived, he would come with armies to eliminate the threat. But if other Jarls believed they could use that heir to challenge Magnus's rule, it could mean civil war across the entire region. I shelter an orphan child who sought mercy from winter's cold, Ragnar said evenly. Nothing more, nothing less. Perhaps, Grim smiled, but the expression held no warmth. Yet rumors persist, and rumors, once started, have a way of becoming truth in the minds of those who profit from believing them. From beneath his wolfskin cloak, Grim produced an ornate gaming set carved from whalebone, pieces for Hnefatafl, the strategic board game that Vikings used to settle disputes too complex for simple combat. The board itself was a work of art, inlaid with silver and marked with runes that spoke to the sacred nature of the contest. I propose a test, Grim announced. Not of strength, which proves only who is larger, but of wisdom, which reveals who is fit to lead. Let your foundling play against my champion. If they prove worthy, I will support whatever claims they may or may not possess. If they fail, the threat hung unspoken in the air. Failure would mean more than losing a game. It would mean losing Grim's protection, leaving Ragnar's clan exposed to whatever vengeance Magnus might bring. Einar stepped forward, without hesitation. I accept the challenge. Grim's champion proved to be his own son, Hakon the Clever, a young man whose reputation for strategic thinking had spread across 3 kingdoms. The bone gaming pieces were arranged with ceremonial precision, each side taking their traditional positions for the ancient battle of king and defenders against overwhelming attackers. The game began slowly, each player testing the other's style and patience. Hakon played with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to victory, pressing his attacking pieces forward in coordinated waves designed to overwhelm through sheer force of numbers. But Einar had learned patience during long winter nights, tending the sacred fire, and strategy from watching how Ragnar managed the complex relationships within the clan. Instead of meeting aggression with aggression, They played a defensive game that frustrated Hakon's attempts to achieve quick victory. Interesting approach, Grim murmured as Einar's king piece evaded yet another carefully planned trap. Most players your age try to prove themselves through bold attacks. Bold attacks against superior numbers rarely succeed, Einar replied, moving a defender to block Hakon's most threatening piece. Sometimes, survival requires patience. The game stretched on for hours, drawing spectators from throughout the settlement as word spread of the contest taking place in the Great Hall. Gradually, Einar's patient defense began to tell, as Hakon's initially overwhelming force was whittled down by careful counterattacks and strategic sacrifices. The final moments came suddenly. Hakon, frustrated by his inability to achieve victory through conventional means, overextended his position in a desperate gambit that left his own forces fatally exposed. "King's escape," Einar announced quietly, moving the royal piece to safety while Hakon's remaining attackers found themselves cut off and surrounded. Grim studied the final position with the eye of someone who had played Nefertafel for decades. His son's defeat was complete and undeniable, achieved not through luck, but through superior strategic thinking. "Well played," he said finally, gathering the bone pieces with careful reverence. "It seems your foundling possesses the kind of wisdom that makes rumors. Interesting. The alliance that emerged from that game would prove crucial in the trials ahead. Though none present could foresee how quickly those trials would arrive. The messenger arrived with the first warm winds of spring, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgent news. He bore the mark of the Merchant Guild, those brave souls who dared to sail the northern seas in search of silver, amber, and exotic goods from distant lands. "Ships have been sighted," he announced to the assembled chieftains who had gathered for the seasonal trading council. "Strange vessels from beyond the ice, carrying word of lands rich with gold and undefended by any army." The great hall buzzed with excited conversation as the messenger spread his sea-worn map across the central table. The parchment was stained with salt water and marked with careful notations in several languages. But the coastlines it depicted were like nothing any of them had seen before. Einar pressed closer, studying the strange symbols and careful measurements that marked harbors, river mouths, and promising landing sites. The map spoke of months of careful observation, of risks taken to gather intelligence about places that existed at the very edge of the known world. Here, the messenger pointed to a cluster of islands marked with symbols indicating settlements. "The monks call it the land of fire and ice, but our scouts report rich fishing grounds, fertile valleys, and natives who fight with stone weapons against iron." "How far?" Ragnar asked, his weathered finger tracing the route marked on the map. 2 weeks sailing with favorable winds and calm seas. Perhaps 3 if the weather turns against us. The messenger rolled the map carefully, treating it like the precious treasure it represented. But the rewards could be beyond counting. The natives mine silver from surface veins, and their rivers run thick with salmon. Magnus had returned from his winter raids just in time to hear this news, and his scarred face lit with the prospect of new conquests. "When do we sail?" he demanded, already calculating how many ships his warband would require. But Ragnar moved more slowly, considering not just the opportunity, but the risks involved. "This would be no simple coastal raid," he said thoughtfully. "We're talking about a major expedition, perhaps permanent settlement, if the land proves as rich as described. Which is exactly why we can't afford to wait," Magnus argued. "Word of this discovery will spread. If we delay, we'll find ourselves competing with every ambitious jarl from here to the Baltic." The debate continued through the afternoon, with practical concerns balanced against the lure of untold riches. Ships would need to be prepared, supplies gathered, warriors selected for their skill and reliability. Most importantly, leadership would need to be established, someone capable of making life-or-death decisions in unknown waters, far from the familiar shores of home. As the discussion progressed, Einar found themselves drawn deeper into the planning, despite their youth and relative inexperience. Their weather-reading abilities had proven valuable during coastal voyages, and their strategic thinking had earned respect among the clan's leaders. The boy should come, Magnus declared suddenly, surprising everyone with his support. Those green eyes see things the rest of us miss, and we'll need every advantage in strange waters. Astrid looked up from the map she'd been studying, her expression mixing pride with concern. Einar's proven themselves here, but this kind of voyage, it's different from anything they've faced before, which is exactly why it's necessary, Ragnar said quietly. A leader learns by facing new challenges, not by staying safely within familiar boundaries. The formal decision came the following morning, after a night of consideration and consultation with the settlement's elders. Einar would join the expedition not merely as a crew member, but as one of Ragnar's trusted advisors, a position that carried both honor and terrible responsibility. The preparations that followed transformed the settlement into a hive of focused activity. Ships were hauled from winter storage and carefully inspected for damage, their hulls sealed with pine tar and their sails mended where winter storms had torn them. Weapons were sharpened, supplies inventoried, and crew lists compiled with the care of men who understood that every decision could mean the difference between triumph and disaster. Einar threw themselves into the work with characteristic intensity, learning the mysteries of navigation and seamanship from sailors who had plied northern waters for decades. They studied the movements of stars and currents, memorized the signs that warned of approaching storms, and practiced with the sextant and compass that would guide them across trackless seas. The night before departure, as the last supplies were loaded and final preparations completed, Einar stood alone on the pier, gazing out at the assembled fleet. 12 ships would make the voyage, carrying nearly 300 souls into the unknown. The responsibility of helping guide so many lives weighed heavily on shoulders that had once trembled beneath. Nothing more than hunger and cold. The sea-worn map had been copied and distributed among the navigators, but Einar carried the original, a tangible connection to the adventure that awaited beyond the horizon. As they fingered its salt-stained edges, they wondered what their parents would think of the path their life had taken. From royal heir to foundling, to explorer of distant seas, tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove themselves worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. But tonight, they were simply a young person standing at the threshold of adventure, ready to sail toward whatever destiny awaited beyond the edge of the world. The village they discovered 3 days inland bore the marks of hasty abandonment, cold hearth fires, scattered belongings, and the lingering scent of fear that seemed to cling to empty doorways like morning mist. Einar walked through the silent streets with growing unease, noting details that spoke to lives interrupted rather than lives lost. They knew we were coming, Eric observed, kicking at a child's wooden toy left forgotten in the dust. Had time to take what mattered and run. Magnus emerged from the largest dwelling with obvious satisfaction, his arms full of silver arm rings and bronze vessels that represented significant wealth to people who counted prosperity in cattle and grain. "Let them run," he said dismissively. They left enough treasure to make the voyage worthwhile. But it was not the abandoned wealth that captured Einar's attention. It was the sound that drifted from the village's edge, so faint it might have been mistaken for wind through autumn leaves. The soft weeping of children trying to remain silent. The kind of desperate quiet that comes from small hearts, understanding that discovery means death. Following the sound led Einar to a root cellar concealed beneath a collapsed shed, where 6 Celtic children huddled in darkness among sacks of turnips and barley. The oldest could not have been more than 10 summers, the youngest still small enough to need carrying. Their eyes reflected terror as absolute as anything Einar had ever seen. "Please," the eldest whispered in broken Norse, learned perhaps from traders or prisoners. "Please don't hurt the little ones." The words struck Einar like a physical blow, carrying them back to their own desperate plea outside Ragnar's settlement. the same desperation, the same willingness to sacrifice self for others, the same terrible vulnerability of the abandoned seeking mercy from those who held power over life and death. "Magnus," Einar called, their voice carefully controlled. "Come see this." The war leader appeared with sword already half drawn, expecting prisoners or hidden treasure. Instead, he found Einar kneeling before the terrified children, offering water from their own flask to lips cracked with thirst and fear. "Slaves?" Magnus asked pragmatically. "The young ones might be worth something in the eastern markets." "Children," Einar corrected firmly. "Just children who were too frightened to run with their families." The tension that followed stretched taut as the string of a war bow. Around them, other Vikings had gathered to see what discovery had been made, their expressions ranging from curiosity to the hard calculation of men who saw everything in terms of profit or loss. "Einar foundling," Magnus said slowly, his voice carrying warning. "These are the enemy's spawn. Today's children become tomorrow's warriors. And tomorrow's warriors remember today's mercy, and today's cruelty creates tomorrow's hatred," Einar replied, helping the smallest child to drink without spilling the precious water. "These are innocents who never raised weapons against us, never chose the fight that claimed their protectors. The debate might have escalated into something worse. But Ragnar's arrival changed the dynamic entirely. The chieftain studied the scene with the careful attention he brought to all difficult decisions, weighing consequences that stretched far beyond the immediate moment. "What do you propose we do with them?" he asked Einar directly. "Find the families that fled. Return the children safely. Show these people that Vikings can be more than destroyers, that we can be protectors of those who cannot protect themselves." The suggestion drew mocking laughter from some of the warriors, but others nodded thoughtfully. Building a settlement in this strange land would require more than military conquest. It would require the kind of relationships that came from demonstrating honor rather than simply imposing fear over the following days. Einar took personal responsibility for the children's welfare, learning their names and simple words in their tongue, while scouts searched for the refugee camps where their families had taken shelter. The blood-stained banner that marked Einar's growing reputation as a war leader now carried a different kind of significance, the symbol of someone willing to fight for the defenseless. Rather than simply fighting for glory, when the reunion finally came, taking place in a neutral meadow under the eyes of both armies, the children's cries of joy echoed across the hillsides like birdsong after winter. Parents who had given their young up for dead wept openly as small arms wrapped around necks and voices babbled stories of the kind. Viking who shared food and sang strange songs to chase away nightmares. "This changes nothing," Magnus warned as they rode back toward their own camp. "Sentiment doesn't build empires or fill treasure chests," but Einar knew better. They had seen the way the Celtic negotiators looked at them during the prisoner exchange, the grudging respect that replaced naked hatred. Building something lasting in this land would require more than Viking steel. It would require Viking honor, demonstrated through actions that proved strength could be tempered with mercy. The banner would fly over many more battles in the days to come, but it would always carry the stain of that first kill and the memory of children's tears transformed into grateful laughter. Both would shape the leader Einar was destined to become. The wound that felled Ragnar came not from enemy blade or arrow, but from the treacherous footing of wet rocks. As he scouted a river crossing in the pre-dawn darkness, the sickening crack of bone-breaking echoed across the water, followed by his sharp intake of breath as he tried unsuccessfully to rise. "Don't move," Einar commanded, splashing through the shallow water to reach their fallen chieftain. The leg bent at an angle that spoke of serious fracture, possibly worse if the bone had pierced through muscle and skin beneath his leather leggings. By full daylight, it was clear that Ragnar would be unable to lead for weeks, perhaps months if the injury failed to heal properly. The expedition found itself stranded in hostile territory with winter approaching, their supplies running low, and no clear consensus about whether to continue deeper inland or retreat to the ships. We go back, Magnus declared at the War Council that evening. Cut our losses, take what treasure we've gathered, and sail for home before the storms trap us here for the winter. And abandon everything we've worked for? Eric countered. The maps show rich settlements just 3 days upriver. We could winter in comfort if we take them before the snow falls. The argument that followed revealed fractures in the expedition's unity that had been hidden beneath successful raiding. Some warriors wanted to continue the aggressive campaign that had brought them wealth and glory, while others feared being trapped far from home with insufficient supplies and a wounded. Leader Einar found themselves thrust into a position they had never sought, the one person both factions trusted to make. Decisions that could mean life or death for 300 souls. The broken shield, propped against the tent wall, served as a constant reminder of how quickly leadership could shift from one person to another. How fragile the line between victory and disaster could be. What does the map tell us about the winter harbors? Einar asked, studying the precious document that had guided them across unknown seas. If we retreat to the ships now, do we have safe anchorage until spring? The question revealed the flaw in Magnus's plan. The anchorage where they had beached their vessels lay exposed to winter storms from the northwest, with no natural protection from the kind of weather that could drive ships onto shore and smash them to kindling. The river mouth offers better shelter, admitted Thorstein, who understood ships and weather better than most. But only if we control both banks. The Celts could harass us all winter if they hold the high ground upstream. Slowly, a different strategy took shape. Not the aggressive conquest Magnus favored, nor the hasty retreat he now advocated, but a careful advance that would secure defensible positions while leaving room for negotiation with local tribes who might prefer trade to warfare. The plan required splitting their force, something that went against every tactical principle Ragnar had taught them. But circumstances had moved beyond conventional wisdom into territory where innovation might mean the difference between survival and destruction. 50 men stay with the ships, Einar decided, their voice carrying the authority that came with responsibility no one else wanted to claim. Fortify the beachhead, prepare for winter defense. The rest of us push upriver, but carefully, scouts out, no unnecessary battles, ready to withdraw if we encounter more resistance than we can handle. Magnus's face showed his disagreement, but he said nothing. The younger warriors looked to Einar with the kind of trust that could not be commanded, only earned through decisions that put their welfare above personal glory. The advance that followed proved Einar's judgment sound. The river settlements, weakened by their earlier defeats, offered submission rather than resistance when approached with offers of trade and protection rather than demands for tribute. By the time the first snows began to fall, the Vikings had established winter quarters that provided shelter, supplies, and the goodwill of neighbors who had discovered that cooperation offered more advantages than hostility. The broken shield that had saved Einar's life during the river crossing became a symbol of leadership earned through sacrifice rather than inherited through blood, unlike the pristine weapons carried by warriors who fought for glory. This battered piece of linden wood and iron spoke to the reality of command, that leaders absorb damage to protect those who followed them. Ragnar, healing slowly in the warm hall they had claimed as winter headquarters, watched his adopted child with pride mixed with concern. "Leadership suits you," he said one evening as Einar reviewed reports from the various outposts. "But remember, the goal is not to become indispensable, but to prepare others to lead when your time comes." "And when will that be?" Einar asked. "Sooner than you think," Ragnar replied, his weathered hand resting on the broken shield. "The young grow old, the strong grow weak, and the wise prepare for what comes next. That's the lesson this shield teaches. Sometimes protecting others means accepting damage yourself." Outside, snow fell steadily on a settlement that had learned to balance strength with mercy, conquest with cooperation. the demands of survival, with the hope of building something lasting in this strange and beautiful land. The delegation arrived on the first clear day after the winter solstice, their banners bearing the crossed axes of the Eastern kingdoms and their message carrying implications that would shake the foundations of everything Einar believed about their place in the world. At their head rode Lord Aldrich the Wise, a man whose silver beard and careful eyes spoke to decades of navigating the treacherous currents of royal politics. Behind him came a smaller group that included scribes, interpreters, and one figure whose presence made Einar's blood run cold. Sven Runereader, the same hermit who had interpreted the stone fragment months earlier in Ragnar's hall. "We come seeking one whose bloodline carries weight in matters of state," Aldrich announced formally as the delegations met in neutral ground between the Viking winter settlement and the Celtic tribal lands. One whose heritage could reshape the balance of power across the northern kingdoms. Ragnar, still moving carefully on his healing leg, exchanged glances with Einar that carried volumes of unspoken communication. They had hoped the secret of royal blood could remain buried in this distant land, but it seemed the past had followed them across the sea. "Speak plainly," Magnus growled, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "What do you want?" From beneath his traveling cloak, Sven produced a small wooden box that Einar recognized with sinking heart. Inside, nestled in silk that had once been white but now showed the yellowing of age, lay a ring that made their breath catch in their throat. The royal seal ring bore the image of a crowned raven, its wings spread in flight, worked in gold that caught the winter sunlight like captured fire. Around the band, runes proclaimed the bearer's right to rule the northern reaches, to command the loyalty of all who acknowledged the ancient bloodlines that had governed those lands for centuries before Magnus Bloodaxe's conquest. "This belonged to King Eirik the Just," Aldrich said quietly, "hidden away when his castle burned, carried by servants who died to preserve it, passed down through 3 generations of guardians who waited for the rightful heir to claim their birthright." Einar stared at the ring with fascination and horror warring in their chest. Here was proof of everything they had tried to forget, everything they had hoped to leave buried beneath the identity of Ragnar's foundling. The weight of destiny seemed to press down upon them like a mountain. "Magnus Bloodaxe grows old," Aldrich continued. "His sons quarrel among themselves over the succession, tearing the kingdom apart with their ambitions. The people cry out for legitimate rule, for someone whose claim comes not from conquest, but from the ancient compact between ruler and ruled." "And you think this child can challenge Magnus and his armies?" Magnus laughed harshly. "One untested youth against the most ruthless king in the north?" "Not alone," Aldrich admitted. "But with the right support, the right alliances, the right moment. Yes, the people remember Eric's justice, his mercy, his wisdom. They would rally to his heir if they believed victory possible." The political maneuvering that followed stretched through 3 days of careful negotiation. Promises were made, terms discussed, the complex web of obligations and rewards that would be necessary to mount a successful campaign against an established throne. But through it all, Einar remained silent, studying the ring that represented everything they had been born to claim, and everything they had learned to fear. Royal blood brought royal responsibility, but it also brought royal dangers, not just to themselves, but to everyone who had shown them loyalty and love. On the final evening, as Aldrich's delegation prepared to depart, Einar requested a private audience with the nobleman. They met in the small chapel the Vikings had built, where the mingled scents of pine incense and sea salt created an atmosphere conducive to difficult truths. "If I refuse," Einar asked directly, "what happens to your cause? We find another claimant, weaker perhaps, but still possessing some fragment of legitimate bloodline. The revolution comes eventually. Too much suffering demands redress. But it might take years longer, cost thousands more lives. And if I accept, you become a target every moment until Magnus Bloodaxe lies dead or you do. Every meal could be your last, every friend a potential assassin, every victory a step closer to the final confrontation that will determine the kingdom's future. That night, alone in their chambers, Einar held the royal seal ring up to the candlelight, watching how the gold caught and reflected the flame. The raven's wings seemed to flutter in the dancing shadows, ready to take flight toward whatever destiny awaited. They thought of Ragnar's kindness, Astrid's sisterly love, the warmth of belonging they had found among people who cared nothing for royal blood and everything for personal worth. Then they thought of the children hidden in root cellars, the fear in Celtic eyes, the price that ordinary people paid for the ambitions of kings. The choice they made would echo through history, but for now, it was simply a young person weighing the competing claims of loyalty, duty, and the desire for a peaceful life, far from the storms of political ambition. The ceremonial drinking horn bore the carved images of ravens and wolves intertwined, their forms spiraling up the polished surface in endless pursuit of one another. Crafted from the horn of an ancient aurochs and bound with silver rings, it had served for generations to seal the most sacred oaths among Ragnar's people, oaths that could not be broken without inviting the wrath of gods and ancestors alike. Einar held the vessel with steady hands as the settlement gathered in the great hall to witness what many understood might be the most important ceremony in their clan's history. Steam rose from the warm mead within, carrying the scents of honey and herbs that spoke to traditions older than written memory. I call upon Thor the Thunderer, Odin the Allfather, and Freyr the Farseer to witness my words, Einar began, their voice carrying clearly through the crowded hall. I, Einar Ragnarsson, called the Foundling, do formally renounce all claims to thrones I never sought, kingdoms I never knew, and titles that belong to the dead past rather than the living present. The gasps that followed this declaration rippled through the assembly like stones thrown into still water. Lord Aldrich, who had remained as their guest through the long winter, rose from his place with obvious shock and dismay. Think carefully, young prince, he urged. You cast aside not just your own birthright, but the hopes of thousands who suffer under Magnus Bloodaxe's tyranny. History will judge this moment, and history remembers those who chose comfort over duty. History will remember that I chose family over ambition, loyalty over legacy, Einar replied calmly. The northern reaches had their chance with my father's generation. If the people truly desire change, let them find it in their own courage, not in the bloodline of kings they never knew. Magnus, who had grown thoughtful during the long winter debates about Einar's future, stepped forward with an expression that mixed approval and concern. Noble words, but words alone won't protect you from those who see your very existence as a threat. Magnus Bloodaxe has spies everywhere, and news of your heritage will reach him eventually. Then let it reach him along with news that the heir of Eirik renounced all claims and chose the life of a Viking adventurer over the throne of kings, Einar said, raising the ceremonial horn higher. Let him know that his nightmares about royal restoration died in this hall. On this day, witnessed by gods and mortals alike, they drank deeply from the horn, the mead burning warm down their throat as the assembled crowd watched in solemn silence. When the vessel was empty, Einar inverted it to show that every drop had been consumed, sealing the oath with their own body as sacrifice and symbol. Astrid stepped forward then, her face showing the complex emotions that had warred within her throughout the winter discussions. As Ragnar's daughter and heir, she understood better than most the weight of renouncing inherited power. But she also understood the price of claiming it. Brother, she said formally, using the clan term that carried more weight than mere blood relationship. Your choice honors our family and protects our people, but it also means we stand together against whatever storms may come. Your enemies become our enemies, your battles our battles. The oath of mutual protection that followed bound not just Einar and Astrid, but the entire clan to the consequences of this moment. They were choosing to remain a family of warriors and explorers rather than becoming the foundation of a new royal dynasty. But they were also accepting that some choices carried permanent consequences. The weeks that followed brought a stream of messengers from the eastern kingdoms, some bearing threats, others offering bribes or alternative arrangements. Einar met with each delegation politely but firmly, making it clear that their decision was final and irrevocable. The most difficult conversation came with Ragnar himself, in the privacy of the chieftain's chamber after the official ceremonies had concluded. The older man studied his adopted child with eyes that held decades of hard-won wisdom about the costs of leadership. "You know this won't end the matter," he said quietly. "Royal blood doesn't become common blood simply because its bearer wishes it so. There will always be those who see opportunity in your heritage, those who would use you as a symbol whether you consent or not. Then we'll deal with those challenges as they come," Einar replied. "But we'll deal with them as a family, as a clan, not as pawns in someone else's Game of Thrones." The ceremonial drinking horn was returned to its place of honor in the hall's treasure room, but its significance would linger long after the mead had been consumed. In choosing family over destiny, loyalty over legacy, Einar had defined not just their own future, but the future of everyone who called them brother, sister, son, daughter. Outside, spring was coming to the strange land they had claimed as their own, bringing with it new possibilities and new dangers. But whatever challenges awaited, they would face them together, not as subjects and sovereign, but as family bound by choices freely made and oaths willingly sworn. The attack came with the spring thaw, when melting snow turned the mountain streams into torrents and the winter-hardened earth began to soften beneath the warming sun. Magnus Bloodaxe had not forgotten the rumors of a surviving heir, and his response to Einar's renunciation was to eliminate the perceived threat with overwhelming force. 500 warriors landed on the beaches where Einar's expedition had first touched this foreign shore, their ships bearing the blood-red banners of the northern reaches and their weapons thirsting for the kind of vengeance that only kings could command. At their head rode Grimwald the Terrible, Magnus's most ruthless general, whose reputation for brutality had earned him fear and respect across 3 kingdoms. The warning came from Celtic scouts who had learned to see the Vikings as protectors rather than conquerors, their swift horses carrying word of the invasion force that moved inland with methodical destruction. Every settlement in their path was put to the sword, every potential ally eliminated before they could offer aid or shelter to the fugitive heir. They mean to leave no one alive who might rally to your banner, Ragnar observed grimly as reports continued to arrive at their winter stronghold. His leg had healed well enough for him to walk without assistance, but the injury had aged him in ways that went beyond physical limitation. From the treasure room, where the clan's most precious artifacts were kept, he retrieved the battle axe that had belonged to his grandfather and his grandfather's father before him. The weapon was perfectly balanced despite its age, its steel still sharp enough to split mail, and its wooden handle worn smooth by generations of warriors' grips. This belonged to Thorvald the Bold, who held the narrow pass at Ravensfjord against 100 enemies, Ragnar said, offering the ancestral weapon to Einar with the solemnity reserved for the most sacred moments. It has never tasted defeat in honest combat, never failed a warrior who carried it with honor. Einar accepted the axe with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of tradition and expectation that came with such a gift. The blade caught the firelight like captured lightning, its edge honed to perfection, despite the decades that had passed since its forging. "I'm not ready for this," Einar admitted quietly, testing the weapon's balance while studying the runes carved into its handle. 3 years ago, I was a starving orphan begging for shelter. Now I'm supposed to lead 300 souls against a professional army? Readiness is a luxury that war seldom provides, Ragnar replied. What matters is not whether you feel prepared, but whether you'll do what needs doing when the moment arrives. The battle preparations that followed tested every lesson Einar had learned about leadership, logistics, and the delicate balance between confidence and caution. Their force was outnumbered nearly 2-1, fighting on ground of the enemy's choosing against, warriors whose only goal was complete annihilation, but they held advantages that Grimwald's conventional thinking could not account for. Knowledge of the local terrain gained through months of exploration, alliances with Celtic tribes who had learned to trust Viking honor, and the desperate courage that came from fighting not for conquest but for survival. The final confrontation came at dawn, in the valley where Copper Creek had carved its path through ancient stone. The same waters that had sustained their winter settlement now serving as the boundary between life and death. Mist rose from the stream in ghostly columns, providing cover for the ambush that Einar had planned, through sleepless nights of agonized calculation. When Grimwald's force entered the valley in pursuit of what they believed were fleeing refugees, they found themselves caught in a killing ground where every rock and tree had been turned into a weapon. Celtic archers rained arrows from concealed positions, while Viking warriors struck from unexpected angles, their coordinated attacks shattering the enemy's formation before it could form proper defensive lines. The personal combat that decided the battle's outcome came when Einar found themselves face to face with Grimwald himself, the ancestral battle axe singing through the air as it met the general's sword in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. The older warrior possessed superior strength and experience, but Einar fought with the fury of someone protecting everything they had learned to love. The decisive moment came when Grimwald, pressing his advantage with brutal efficiency, overextended himself in what should have been a killing blow. Einar's counterstrike, guided by instinct and desperation, found the gap in his opponent's armor where neck met shoulder, ending the fight with the finality that only death could provide. As Grimwald fell, his army's morale shattered like ice in spring sun. The survivors fled toward their ships, carrying word back to Magnus Bloodaxe that his nephew's quest for vengeance had ended in catastrophic defeat. Standing over the fallen general's body, the ancestral battle-axe heavy in their hands, Einar felt the weight of command settle upon their shoulders like a mantle of iron and responsibility. The foundling who had once begged for shelter had become a war leader whose name would be whispered in the halls of kings. The longships that crested the final ridge before home harbor bore scars that told stories of triumph and survival, their hulls darkened by salt spray and their sails patched with cloth taken from a dozen different battles. At their prows stood warriors who had sailed into legend and returned bearing the kind of wealth that minstrels would sing about for generations. Einar stood at the bow of Ragnar's vessel, watching the familiar outline of their settlement grow larger against the backdrop of mountains that had sheltered their people for 3 generations. The victory feast cup in their hands, specially crafted by Celtic metalworkers, as tribute to their unexpected protector, caught the afternoon sunlight like captured. Gold, worked silver formed intricate patterns around the cup's surface, depicting scenes from their great adventure, ships battling storms, warriors facing unknown enemies, the moment when mercy triumphed over conquest in the protection of innocent children. It was more than a drinking vessel. It was a chronicle of how a desperate orphan had grown into a leader worthy of saga and song. The settlement had grown during their absence, new buildings rising where empty land had once stretched toward the forest. Smoke rose from forge fires and cooking hearths, while the sounds of daily life, children playing, cattle lowing, the ring of hammer on anvil, drifted across the water like a song of peace and prosperity. "Look there," Astrid pointed toward the harbor, where a crowd was gathering to welcome the returning heroes. "The whole settlement's come out to greet us." But Einar's attention was drawn to a smaller figure standing apart from the celebration, An elderly woman whose white hair gleamed in the sunlight and whose bearing spoke to authority, earned through wisdom rather than conquest. As their ship drew closer to shore, recognition struck like lightning. "Grandmother Helga," Einar whispered, remembering the settlement's eldest resident who had been like a second mother to everyone born within its walls. She had been ancient when they first arrived as a desperate child, and her survival through another harsh winter seemed nothing short of miraculous. The homecoming that followed exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. Tables groaned under the weight of feast foods prepared in their honor, while ale flowed freely and voices rose in songs that would add new verses to the clan's collection of heroic tales. Einar moved through the celebration with the easy grace of someone who had learned to balance personal humility with the public role that leadership demanded. They shared stories of distant shores and foreign peoples, distributed gifts brought from across the sea, and listened with genuine interest to tales of what had transpired during their long absence. "You've changed," Grandmother Helga observed during a quiet moment when the formal celebrations had given way to smaller gatherings around individual hearth fires. "Still the same soul, I remember, but tempered by experience, like good steel shaped by a mastersmith." "The world has a way of changing people whether they want to be changed or not," Einar replied, settling beside the old woman on the bench that had been her traditional place for more years than anyone could count. "Sometimes I barely recognize the person I was when I first stumbled to your gates." "Oh, but I recognized you," Helga said with a knowing smile. "Saw it in your eyes that first night, the spark that marks someone destined for great things. The question was never whether you'd find your path, but whether you'd have the wisdom to choose the right one when the time came." The victory feast cup passed from hand to hand throughout the evening, each person taking a drink and sharing a memory or blessing. When it finally returned to Einar's hands, filled with mead that tasted of home and belonging, they raised it high enough for everyone to see. "To family chosen rather than given," they called out, their voice carrying across the hall. "To bonds forged in hardship and strengthened by loyalty. To the settlement that took in a stranger and made them kin. And to the adventures that taught us the true meaning of home." The cheer that followed shook the rafters and sent echoes rolling across the water toward mountains that had witnessed generations of similar celebrations. Outside, the aurora began its nightly dance across the star-filled sky, painting the darkness in shades of green and gold that seemed to celebrate their safe return. As the night deepened and the celebration gradually wound down, Einar remained in the great hall, studying the victory feast cup that had chronicled their journey from desperate orphan to respected leader. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but tonight was for gratitude, for the simple joy of being home among people who had chosen to love them despite knowing nothing of their origins or destiny. The cup would take its place among the settlement's treasures, but its true value lay not in silver and craftsmanship, but in the memories it preserved of a journey that had transformed not just one life, but an entire community's understanding of what family could mean. The chieftain's cloak felt heavier on Einar's shoulders than any weapon they had ever carried, its wolfskin lining still warm from Ragnar's body, as the formal ceremony of succession concluded in the great hall where their journey had truly begun. Woven into the dark fabric were symbols that told the story of their clan, silver threads depicting ravens and wolves, golden clasps shaped like Thor's hammer, and along the hem, new additions that marked Einar's own contributions to the family's legacy. "Wear it well," Ragnar said quietly, his weathered hands settling the cloak with the care of a father preparing his child for the world's challenges. The injury to his leg had healed, but the long journey and recent battles had aged him in ways that went beyond physical limitation. "Remember that leadership is not about commanding others, but about serving something larger than yourself." The assembled clan members watched with the solemnity reserved for moments that would echo through generations. Here stood the orphan who had stumbled to their gates in desperate need, now ready to guide their people through whatever storms might come. The transformation was complete, yet something essential remained unchanged, the compassion that had marked Einar from that first night when they chose mercy over vengeance in protecting Celtic children. As spring gave way to summer and summer ripened into autumn, Einar's leadership was tested not by enemies or crises, but by the daily decisions that shaped a community's character. Trade agreements with neighboring settlements, disputes between clan members, the delicate balance between tradition and adaptation that every leader must navigate. The chieftain's cloak became a familiar sight throughout the region as Einar traveled to councils and negotiations, its distinctive patterns recognized by allies and rivals alike. But it was during a routine visit to the harbor that the cloak's deeper significance became clear, when a small group of travelers appeared on the horizon, not warriors or merchants, but families carrying the unmistakable burden of displacement and desperation. More refugees from the eastern kingdoms, reported Eric, now grown into a trusted advisor whose loyalty had been forged through shared hardship. Magnus Bloodaxe continues his purges, and people flee wherever they can find ships to carry them. Among the refugees, Einar recognized a scene that might have been lifted from their own memories. Children with hollow eyes, and parents whose faces showed the particular exhaustion that comes from traveling too far on too little hope. At the group's edge, barely visible among the larger figures, huddled a small form that made Einar's heart clench with recognition. The boy could not have been more than 7 summers, his clothes reduced to rags, and his bare feet bleeding from walking on unfamiliar ground. When he looked up at the approaching chieftain, his eyes held the same desperate courage that Einar remembered feeling in their own chest years earlier. "Please," the child whispered, his voice barely audible above the harbor wind. "I can work. I can do anything you need. Just let me stay. Just one night." The word struck Einar like an echo from another life, carrying them back to their own moment of ultimate vulnerability, when survival depended entirely on the mercy of strangers. Around them, the clan members who remembered that long-ago night watched with understanding, seeing the cycle complete itself in ways that felt both inevitable and miraculous. "What's your name, child?" Einar asked gently, kneeling to bring themselves to the boy's eye level. "Olaf," came the whispered reply. "My parents. There was fire. I ran like they told me to run, and I kept running until I couldn't anymore." Einar reached out and lifted the child's chin with one finger, seeing in those frightened eyes the same mixture of fear and hope that had marked their own arrival at this same harbor. The chieftain's cloak spread around them both like shelter from the storm, its warmth encompassing more than just physical comfort. "Well then, Olaf," Einar said, standing and extending their hand to help the boy to his feet. "Let me tell you about the hardest job in our settlement. There's a sacred fire that burns in the temple hall, and it must never be allowed to die. The person who tends it carries the responsibility for keeping our connection to the gods alive through the long winter nights." As they walked toward the settlement with the newest member of their growing family, Einar reflected on the strange paths that life could take. The desperate plea whispered in darkness had become a legacy that would outlive them all. Not the throne they had renounced, but something far more valuable. The understanding that strength's highest purpose was to shelter the weak, and that every ending contained within it the seeds of new beginning. The chieftain's cloak would pass to other shoulders in time, carrying with it the story of how one desperate whisper had forged bonds stronger than blood, and created a family that measured wealth not in gold, but in the lives it touched and transformed.